A train idles at a quiet terminal in Hoboken, New Jersey. It is November the 20th, 1910. The platform is dark, no reporters, no crowds, no one waiting to be seen. One by one, 6 men climb aboard a private rail car, not together, not as a group, but spaced apart, arriving like strangers who happen to share a destination. They carry guns, they carry hunting coats. To anyone watching, they are simply going duck hunting, somewhere quiet, somewhere south. They are not going duck hunting. These 6 men are, at this moment, among the most powerful financiers on the face of the earth. Men whose decisions move markets, topple banks, and steer the fortunes of a nation. And they are about to disappear. For the next 10 days, they will vanish from New York, from Washington, from history itself, behind the gates of a secluded Millionaires Club on a Georgia island most Americans have never heard of. What they write behind those gates, in secret, under false names, sworn to silence, will become the foundation of the most powerful financial institution in the United States. An institution that, more than a century later, still decides how much your money is worth. And for 20 years, every single one of them would deny it ever happened. To understand why 6 of the richest men in America needed to vanish into secrecy, we have to go back 24 years to the founding of the strange, gilded, and ultimately doomed island retreat that made it all possible. Chapter 1: The Island Before the Millionaires. Long before the millionaires came, long before the gates and the gilded names, this stretch of Georgia coastline already belonged to someone else. For thousands of years, native people moved along these marshes and barrier islands, fishing the tidal creeks, hunting the maritime forest. By the 1500s, the Spanish had arrived, charting the coastline, building a chain of missions to convert the people who lived here. They gave the island a name of their own, Isla de Balenas, the Island of Whales, for the great right whales that once passed offshore. Then came the British. In 1733, General James Oglethorpe founded the colony of Georgia, and a few years later, he renamed this small island after a friend and financial backer of the colony, a wealthy Englishman named Sir Joseph Jekyll, a man who, as far as history records, never once set foot on the land that would carry his name into the 20th century. For most of the next century, the island passed through a handful of owners, until it came into the hands of the Dubignon family, French exiles who built a plantation here, worked by the forced labor of enslaved people. And in November of 1858, 50 years after the United States had officially outlawed the importing of enslaved Africans, a smuggling ship called the Wanderer ran ashore on Jekyll's southern tip, carrying roughly 400 captives. It was one of the last known landings of its kind on American soil, a crime committed in defiance of the law, on a beach that the world would later remember for very different reasons. By the time the Civil War ended the plantation economy, the island had already absorbed centuries of conquest, conversion, and bondage, layer after layer of history that would soon be buried beneath manicured lawns and oyster shell roads. The wealthiest men in America were about to arrive, looking for an untouched paradise. It was never untouched at all. Chapter 2: The Sale and the Founding. By the 1880s, the Dubignon family had owned Jekyll Island for nearly a century, but Newton Finney, a former Confederate officer who had married into the family, saw something the Dubignons hadn't: an opportunity. Finney suggested to his brother-in-law, John Eugene Dubignon, that the island could be sold, not as farmland, not as a plantation, but as something entirely new, a private winter retreat, a hideaway for the wealthiest men in the North, men who wanted nothing more than to escape the cold and disappear from public view for a season. Dubignon agreed, and so, in December of 1885, Finney and a New York associate named Oliver King gathered a group of investors and petitioned the courts of Glynn County, Georgia. They incorporated themselves as the Jekyll Island Club. The plan was simple, and it worked almost immediately. They offered 100 shares of club stock, priced at $600 each, equivalent to roughly $15,000 in today's money, and sold them to 50 of the wealthiest men in America. On February the 17th, 1886, the deal was finalized. the entire island changed hands for $125,000, a fortune at the time, but a fraction of what its new owners were worth individually. Within weeks, construction began. The club hired an architect to design the clubhouse and a landscape architect to lay out the grounds. Ground broke that August. By November the 1st, the clubhouse stood complete, a striking Queen Anne building crowned with a turret, rising out of land that had belonged, in one form or another, to plantation owners, smugglers, missionaries, and native peoples for centuries before. The club elected its first leadership that spring. Lloyd Aspinwall, a respected New York attorney, was chosen as president, but Aspinwall would never see the clubhouse open. Just 5 months into his presidency, before the first guest ever walked through its doors, Aspinwall died suddenly. Another club officer stepped up to take his place. The club did not pause for grief. It rarely would in the decades to come. On January the 21st, 1888, the Jekyll Island Club officially opened its doors for the first time, welcoming a small but glittering circle of America's wealthiest families to a clubhouse built for exclusivity, secrecy, and comfort in equal measure. None of them could have known what would one day be decided behind those walls. Chapter 3. 1/6 of the world's wealth. Within a few short years, the Jekyll Island Club had become something almost impossible to comprehend by any ordinary measure of wealth. Its membership roster read like a registry of American power itself. John Pierpont Morgan, the banker who could single-handedly steady the nation's finances. William Rockefeller, brother to the founder of Standard Oil. William Kissam Vanderbilt, heir to a railroad empire. Joseph Pulitzer, the newspaper magnate. Marshall Field, the retail titan. The Goulds, the Astors. Names that, even now, more than a century later, still echo through American history. In 1904, Munsey's magazine described the club in a single, unforgettable phrase, calling it the richest, the most exclusive, the most inaccessible club in the world. It was not an exaggeration. By most estimates, the members of the Jekyll Island Club, taken together, controlled roughly 1/6 of the entire world's wealth. One small, secluded island off the coast of Georgia. One dining room where an entire sixth of the planet's fortune might gather at a single mealtime. Membership was capped, never more than 100 shares, and an invitation was not for sale at any price. It required something money alone could not buy. You had to be wealthy, yes, but you also had to be, in the words of those who remembered the club fondly, fun to be around. This was not Wall Street. This was supposed to be an escape from it. In its earliest years, the club's pastimes leaned toward the old aristocratic traditions of the hunt. Gamekeepers stocked the island with pheasant, turkey, quail, and deer, and members were expected to report each day's kill, which was then proudly served at dinner. But as the years passed, the rituals shifted. Golf courses replaced hunting blinds. Tennis courts and croquet lawns spread across the manicured grounds. Costume balls and dinner dances filled the clubhouse with music late into the night. By the 1920s, members had even taken to racing small open-air vehicles called red bugs across the hard-packed sand of the beach. Automotive toys for people who had never had to ask the price of anything in their lives. And yet, for all its extravagance, the members of Jekyll Island insisted, almost defensively, that this was the simple version of their lives. Compared to their summer estates in Newport, Rhode Island, with their marble ballrooms and manicured hedges trimmed into geometric perfection, Jekyll Island felt to them almost rustic. Here, the roads were paved in crushed oyster shell. The cottages, despite housing 20 or 30 rooms apiece, were called cottages, not mansions, as though scale itself could be willed into modesty by a difference in vocabulary. They wore their finest clothes to dinner and still believed somehow that they were living plainly. It was, in its own way, a perfect symbol of the era. The Gilded Age did not hide its wealth so much as disguise it, dressing extraordinary excess in the language of unassuming leisure, a hunting lodge that happened to host 1/6 of the world's money, a retreat from luxury that was, itself, one of the most luxurious places on earth. But outside the gates of that clubhouse, the nation these men ruled from a distance was beginning to come apart at the seams. and the men responsible for the cracks were the very same ones playing croquet on Jekyll's manicured lawns. Chapter 4. The Cottages and the People Behind Them. Behind every cottage on Jekyll Island stood a story, and not all of them ended gently. In March of 1914, fire broke out in the attic of Solterra, the graceful 12-room cottage belonging to the Baker family. By the time it was extinguished, the house was gone, reduced to ash in a matter of hours. Frederick Baker had died the year before. His widow, with little reason left to hold on to the property, sold the empty lot to Richard Teller Crane Jr., a Chicago plumbing magnate. Out of Solterra's ashes rose Crane Cottage, an opulent Italian Renaissance villa, one of the grandest structures ever built on the island. Today, almost nothing remains of the original house. Only a small dovecote and a brick planter survive, quiet markers of what burned. But the cottages were never simply backdrops for the wealthy. Each one ran on the constant, unseen labor of dozens of people whose names rarely made it into the club's official records. A short distance from the clubhouse, behind the manicured lawns and oyster shell roads the members strolled each evening, stood a separate settlement, 10 small houses with bright red roofs, known to those who lived there as Red Row. This was home to the African-American men and women who cooked, cleaned, drove carriages, and tended grounds for the wealthiest families in the country, segregated from the members they served, yet building a community of their own. For more than half a century, this was the unspoken architecture of the club, extraordinary wealth on one side of an invisible line, and the labor that sustained it on the other. When the state of Georgia purchased the island in 1947, the families of Red Row had no further reason to stay. There was no membership to serve any longer, no clubhouse left to keep running. One by one, the small houses were abandoned, then left to rot, then finally torn down or lost altogether. By the late 1970s, only a single structure remained, repurposed as a tool shed. Eventually, even that disappeared. Today, nothing physically marks where Red Row once stood. The cottages of the Millionaires were preserved, restored, and turned into museums, gift shops, and wedding venues. The homes of the people who kept those cottages running were simply allowed to vanish. One more layer of this island's history erased. Chapter 5. A Nation Built on Cracked Foundations. While the members of Jekyll Island danced through their winters, hunted their game, and raced their little motor cars along the beach, the country that made them rich was quietly falling apart. Between 1863 and 1910, the United States endured at least 3 major banking panics, and by some counts, as many as 8 smaller, more localized ones. Roughly every 15 years, like clockwork, the system would buckle. Banks would suspend operations. Depositors would lose their savings. Long, grinding recessions would follow, and ordinary Americans, farmers, shopkeepers, laborers, would pay the price for a system that the wealthiest men in the country had built, profited from, and somehow never fixed. The problem ran deep, down into the very structure of American money itself. The nation's currency was tied directly to a fixed supply of government bonds, which meant the amount of cash in circulation could not expand or contract along with the actual needs of the economy. Every autumn, when farmers needed cash to bring in the harvest, and every winter, when shoppers needed cash for the holidays, the same fixed frozen supply of currency had to stretch to cover demand that surged and then receded. There was no flexibility built into the system at all, and if a bank wanted to issue new currency, it first had to purchase government bonds, deposit them with the Treasury, wait for approval, and then wait again for the new notes to be printed and shipped. The entire process could take nearly 3 weeks. 3 weeks in a country where panic could spread through a city's banks in a single afternoon. Compounding the problem was the sheer fragmentation of the system itself. Most states forbade banks from opening branches, which meant that by the turn of the century, there were more than 27,000 individual banks scattered across the country, each one isolated, vulnerable, and connected to the others only through a tangled, fragile web of interbank deposits and clearinghouses. When trouble struck one corner of that web, It could spread through the rest of it like fire through dry grass, with no central authority anywhere capable of stepping in to stop it. In Europe, things worked differently. Central banks there could expand or contract the money supply by adjusting discount rates, and could step in directly as a lender of last resort when panic threatened to spiral out of control. America had no such mechanism. America had only itself, and increasingly that meant America had only one man. That man's name was John Pierpont Morgan, and in October of 1907, the nation would learn exactly how much its financial stability depended on the judgment of a single aging banker. The panic began at the Knickerbocker Trust Company in New York City, as depositors, suddenly fearful over rumors of reckless speculation, rushed to withdraw their money all at once. Lines stretched out the door. The Knickerbocker collapsed within days. The panic spread immediately to the Trust Company of America, and then to the Lincoln Trust Company, each new failure feeding the fear that triggered the next one. Morgan, then approaching 70 years old, returned to New York and effectively appointed himself the nation's emergency central bank. Working out of his private library, he summoned the city's leading bankers and began making decisions that, in any rational system, should never have rested in the hands of one private citizen. Which institutions were worth saving, which were not. Two of his lieutenants were tasked with examining the books of the failing trust companies and reporting back on which ones could be trusted with a rescue. They could not, in good conscience, vouch for the Knickerbocker. It was allowed to fail, but they judged the Trust Company of America to be fundamentally sound, simply caught in a wave of panic it didn't deserve. On Morgan's word, a consortium of bankers extended it a $10 million loan. Soon after, Morgan arranged additional loans, $25 million, then another $10 million, to prop up the New York Stock Exchange itself, which had come dangerously close to a complete shutdown. John D. Rockefeller, watching from the sidelines, added another $10 million of his own to steady the trust companies further. The panic finally broke. The country was saved not by any government agency, not by any act of Congress, but by the personal intervention of private financiers who happened to have both the resources and the willingness to act. It was effective. It was also terrifying when people stopped to think about it. The full weight of the American economy had rested in the hands of men who answered to no one but themselves. Among those paying close attention to the unfolding crisis was a powerful senator who would soon set this entire story in motion. He pushed a bill through Congress establishing the National Monetary Commission, tasked with studying the nation's financial system and recommending reform, and made himself chairman. He made clear from the outset that he had no intention of leaving the real work to politicians. As he saw it, drafting a workable solution was a task for financial experts, not for members of Congress who barely understood the system they were meant to fix. He hired advisors and set off for an extended tour of Europe, meeting with bankers and central bank officials, studying how other nations had solved the very problems still plaguing the United States. He left for that tour a skeptic, defending the existing bond-backed currency system and doubting that America truly needed anything as radical as a central bank. But what he saw in Europe changed his mind completely. He returned home convinced that the United States needed a central banking system of its own, built along the same lines that had kept European economies stable for generations. There was only one problem. He understood with total clarity exactly how the American public would react to the idea of a central bank designed in close consultation with the very Wall Street bankers who had just demonstrated for the whole country to see how dangerously concentrated their private power already was. If word got out that Morgan's own partners were helping write the blueprint for a new national financial authority, the plan would be dead before it ever reached the floor of Congress. Suspicion alone would kill it. If this plan was ever going to work, it could not be written in the open. It could not be written in Washington, where reporters watched every move. It would have to be written somewhere far away, isolated, where no one would think to look, and it would have to be written in absolute, unbreakable secrecy. He already knew exactly where. Chapter 6. The Duck Hunt. This is where it happens. This is the moment everything in this story has been building toward. In November of 1910, Senator Nelson Aldrich made his decision, He would gather a small group of the country's foremost financial minds, retreat somewhere far from prying eyes, and write a working blueprint for an American central bank. Congress was due to reconvene in only a matter of weeks. There was no time left to waste, and absolutely no room for the plan to leak before it was finished. To even attempt this meeting in New York or Washington was unthinkable. So, Aldrich devised a cover story so simple that no one would think twice about it. The senator was going duck hunting, that was all. A private hunting party, heading south for some quiet sport. On the night of November the 20th, the men began arriving one at a time at a quiet, unremarkable train terminal in Hoboken, New Jersey. They did not arrive together. Each man came alone, slipping onto the platform in darkness, carrying hunting rifles and heavy coats, climbing aboard Aldrich's private rail car, as though this truly were nothing more than a weekend sport. Once aboard the train, the men dropped their last names entirely, speaking carefully in front of porters and staff who might otherwise have recognized faces that, between them, controlled an almost unimaginable share of the nation's wealth. Two of them took the disguise even further, abandoning their own first names altogether. By one man's own account, written years later, the two of them settled on a private joke. Since they considered themselves always correct, one became Wilbur, and the other became Orville, borrowed with quiet humor from the Wright brothers. For decades afterward, the two men would continue calling each other Wilbur and Orville, a private joke shared by no one else alive. The group, half seriously, began referring to themselves as the First Name Club. Once the train reached Georgia and the men crossed onto Jekyll Island itself, the doors closed behind them. For the better part of 10 days, they were completely disappeared from the world. They woke before sunrise. They worked late into the night, one of the most intense and demanding periods of work any of them had ever endured. And it was not always harmonious work. Though the men agreed on certain broad principles, they disagreed, sometimes fiercely, on the details that mattered most. Aldrich himself wanted something close to the straightforward European model, one central bank, plainly and visibly in charge. But the German-born banker among them understood something Aldrich did not yet fully appreciate. The American public would never accept anything that looked like a single, centralized Wall Street bank with that much open power. If this plan was going to survive contact with Congress, with newspapers, and with an already suspicious public, it would need to look different than what it actually was. It would need the appearance of decentralization, even while its core mechanics functioned essentially as Aldrich had always envisioned. It was the same instinct that had driven the entire trip from the very beginning: disguise the true nature of the thing, and it has a chance of surviving. That argument won out. By the time the men finally boarded the train back north, they had completed a working blueprint for what they called the Reserve Association of America, a single central institution governed through 15 regional branches scattered across the country, each one responsible for holding member banks' reserves, issuing currency, and discounting commercial loans, all coordinated by a national body with the power to set interest rates for the entire system at once. They had built in 10 secret days on a hunting island, the working architecture of what would one day become the Federal Reserve System of the United States. No one outside that clubhouse had any idea it had happened at all. Chapter 7. The Plan, Its Burial, and Its Rebirth. They had the blueprint, now they had to deliver it. Shortly after returning from Jekyll Island, Senator Aldrich fell seriously ill, too unwell to write the formal report that would carry the group's plan to Congress. The task fell instead to two of his colleagues, who traveled to Washington to put the finishing touches on what the men had built in secret. In January of 1911, Aldrich presented the plan to the National Monetary Commission. A full year later, a final report and accompanying legislation reached Congress, carrying a new name designed to sound suitably official and impersonal: the National Reserve Association. In the letter that accompanied the report, the Commission described what it had created as an institution, scientific in its method and democratic in its control. It was a careful choice of words, and it didn't work. Almost immediately, suspicion took hold. Critics, particularly Democrats, looked closely at the plan's actual structure and saw something deeply troubling: Under the proposed system, the largest banks would receive proportionally greater voting power within each regional branch. To many Americans, this looked less like reform and more like a permanent, legally enshrined version of exactly the kind of concentrated Wall Street control the public feared most. With a presidential election fast approaching, the Democratic Party made opposition to the Aldrich Plan a central plank of its platform, branding it as a Wall Street scheme dressed up as public policy. When Woodrow Wilson won the presidency and Democrats swept into control of both houses of Congress, Aldrich's National Reserve Association appeared to die exactly where it stood, shelved, buried, disowned by the very government it had been written for. But the underlying problem the Jekyll Island men had spent 10 secret days solving had not gone anywhere. The country still needed a way to stabilize its currency and prevent the next panic from spiraling the way 1907 nearly had. And as it turned out, several leading Democrats, including President Wilson himself, understood this just as clearly as Aldrich did. Representative Carter Glass of Virginia, chairman of the House Committee on Banking and Currency, began developing his own proposal. Not a single centralized institution, but a system of separate regional reserve banks, paired with a Federal Reserve Board of presidential appointees to provide federal oversight. A parallel bill took shape in the Senate, and quietly, the architects of this new legislation turned to the same source of technical expertise that Aldrich had relied on 3 years earlier, the same man who had helped engineer the original disguise on Jekyll Island. His reputation for genuine mastery of banking mechanics was respected by Republicans and Democrats alike, regardless of where the original plan had come from. Glass and his Senate counterpart consulted him directly. President Wilson's own closest advisors corresponded with him as well, discussing the shape the new legislation should take. Piece by piece, it wore a different face entirely. Where Aldrich's plan had proposed a single national institution with branches, the new Federal Reserve Act proposed regional independence layered beneath federal oversight. Where Aldrich's plan had been attacked as a Wall Street creation, the new bill was framed as a democratic compromise between Wall Street's interests and the concerns of ordinary Americans, farmers, and small banks. And yet, beneath that different political skin, the technical machinery was remarkably similar. The same core insight survived almost entirely intact. Historians who later compared the two documents side by side found entire provisions that allegedly echoed one another, almost word for word. What had changed was the chassis built around it, designed specifically to make the public believe they were getting something fundamentally different from what Wall Street had originally proposed. On December the 23rd, 1913, President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into law. It is worth sitting with the full shape of what had actually happened. The American public had explicitly rejected the Aldrich Plan at the ballot box. They had voted against it. They believed that they had defeated Wall Street's vision for the nation's money supply and replaced it with something more democratic, more accountable, and more genuinely their own. And in the most important technical respects, they had not defeated it at all. They had adopted it. The institution that still sets the cost of borrowing money for every American today, that still decides how much currency moves through the economy, that still answers ultimately to a structure of regional banks and federal oversight nearly identical to what was first sketched out by lamplight on Jekyll Island. That institution exists because secrecy worked exactly as its architects had hoped it would. The public thought they had stopped it, but they had only renamed it. Chapter 8: 20 Years of Silence. For 2 decades, the truth of what happened on Jekyll Island lived only in the memories of the men who were there. The first crack in that silence came in 1916, when a journalist named B.C. Forbes somehow learned fragments of the story and published an account of the secret meeting. He described bankers slipping out of New York under cover of darkness, vanishing onto a guarded island, working in total secrecy to draft what would become the foundation of the nation's currency system. It should have been an explosive revelation. It wasn't. Almost no one paid attention. Those few who did read it dismissed the story as little more than rumor, not a serious claim about how the most important financial legislation in the country's history had actually been written. The men involved said nothing publicly to confirm or deny it. They simply let the story pass, unchallenged and unconfirmed, And so, the silence held. For year after year, none of the participants ever spoke openly about what had truly happened on that island. The silence finally broke not because of Forbes, but because of pride. In 1927, Carter Glass published a memoir titled An Adventure in Constructive Finance, in which he claimed sole authorship of the ideas behind the Federal Reserve Act. For the men who had actually built the technical foundation of that legislation in secret 17 years earlier, this was too much to bear in silence. A bitter public feud erupted. A former counsel to the House Committee on Banking and Currency published a scathing rebuttal accusing Glass of presenting fiction and a work of imagination. A respected economics professor at Columbia University argued publicly in a heated exchange of letters published in the New York Times that the Federal Reserve Act was, in its essential character, the work of one man more than any other. That man could no longer stay quiet. In 1930, he published a sprawling 2-volume history of the Federal Reserve System's true origins, including a meticulous line-by-line comparison of the original Aldrich Bill against the final Glass-Owen legislation, methodically proving just how closely the two documents matched. He wrote that he had originally intended simply to rest in California for 3 months, but Glass's public claims of credit had compelled him to set the record straight in his own words. Even then, he never named Jekyll Island directly in his book. He alluded only to a secret, several-day conference with Aldrich. Bound by a pledge of confidentiality, he still felt obligated to honor nearly 2 decades later. It was Aldrich's own biographer who finally broke the silence completely. In 1930, with Aldrich himself 5 years in his grave, the surviving members of the First Name Club at last confirmed that the meeting had happened exactly as Forbes once claimed. It had taken 20 years. It had taken a wounded ego, a public feud, and a dead man's biography. But the truth at last was finally out. Chapter 9: The Last Golden Years. While the world slowly absorbed the truth about what had happened on Jekyll Island, the club itself carried on, savoring what would turn out to be its final golden years. In January of 1915, the island had already secured its place in the history of American technology when a club member who served as president of AT&T took part in the nation's first transcontinental telephone call, speaking simultaneously with Alexander Graham Bell in New York, Bell's assistant in San Francisco, and President Woodrow Wilson himself in Washington. It was a moment of genuine modern pride, proof that this small, secluded island was still, somehow, at the very center of the nation's progress. Through the 1920s, the club enjoyed what many historians consider its true peak. Golf had long since overtaken hunting as the favored pastime. Costume balls filled the clubhouse late into the night. Members raced their motorized redbugs across the hard-packed sand of the beach, competing now with the glamorous resorts rising along the coast of Florida for the attention of America's wealthiest families. For a few more years, Jekyll Island held its own, but the music was already running out of time. The stock market collapse of October 1929 did not spare the men who had once represented such an outsized share of the world's wealth. Fortunes that had seemed unshakable evaporated within months. Membership began to hemorrhage as families found themselves unable, or unwilling, to maintain the cost of an island retreat they could no longer justify. By 1933, the club's leadership, increasingly desperate to keep the doors open, introduced something that would have been unthinkable in the club's earlier years: a new and more affordable tier of membership, known as the Associate Membership, aimed at drawing in younger and less wealthy families who could never have afforded a full share in the club's heyday. It worked for a little while. New names appeared on the roster. The clubhouse, for a few more seasons, still filled with guests. It was not enough. Throughout the 1930s, membership continued its slow, steady decline as the Great Depression tightened its grip on even the country's most insulated families. Then came the war. The club opened again in early January. The same rituals, the same staff preparing the grounds, the same rhythm the island had followed since 1888. And in early April, the season simply ended. The furniture was covered, the windows were shuttered, the grounds were prepared for next year. But there would be no next year. By this point, America's involvement in the Second World War had pulled away the very people who kept the club running. Much of the male staff had left to enlist in the armed forces. Without them, continuing to operate the club at anything resembling its former standard had become simply impossible. Only days after that final season closed, the war arrived on Georgia's doorstep. A German submarine struck 2 American tankers in the waters near Sea Island, not far up the coast from Jekyll itself. Debris from the wreckage washed ashore along the island's northern beaches in the weeks that followed. United States Army personnel soon arrived to man observation posts along the coastline, watching the waters for further enemy activity, using the club's own grounds for communications, and as a makeshift dining hall for soldiers who, only months earlier, would never have been permitted past the gates. There was no dramatic final scene, no grand announcement, no single moment when anyone declared that the Jekyll Island Club was finished. It simply never opened again. The clubhouse that had once hosted the wealthiest families in the world simply sat empty, waiting for a season that was never going to come. For an institution built almost entirely on appearances, there was something fitting in how it all came apart in the end. No scandal, no dramatic collapse, just an empty clubhouse, a war moving past it, and a silence that no one would ever break. Chapter 10: Decay and Resurrection. For 5 long years, Jekyll Island sat in a kind of suspended animation. The clubhouse stood empty. The cottages, once filled with the laughter of America's wealthiest families, sat silent behind closed shutters. A small skeleton staff was kept on, just enough to mow the lawns and patch the worst of the damage, in the fading hope that the members might one day return and the old life might somehow resume. They never did. The war ended. The fortunes that had sustained the club for more than half a century had either vanished in the Depression or simply moved on to other pursuits, other resorts, other ways of spending money. Weeds crept up through the once manicured lawns, paint peeled from porches that had hosted presidents and financiers, windows left unattended through hurricane seasons and salt-heavy coastal air began to crack and shatter, one by one, in buildings that had once represented the absolute pinnacle of American luxury. In 1946, Georgia's State Revenue Commissioner set his sights on Jekyll Island, hoping to convert one of the state's barrier islands into a public park accessible to ordinary citizens. A deliberate, almost poetic reversal of everything the island had once stood for. On June 2, 1947, the state finalized the purchase through condemnation proceedings, paying $675,000 for an island that had once represented a meaningful fraction of the wealth of the entire planet. Georgia tried for a time to operate the old club facilities as a public resort, open to anyone willing to pay for a room rather than an invitation. It never quite worked. Despite genuine effort and investment, the venture struggled financially year after year, unable to recapture whatever strange alchemy had once made this island so desirable to the men who built it. By 1971, the state shut the operation down entirely. The clubhouse and its surrounding cottages, having survived the Gilded Age, the Depression, and a world war, now faced the much quieter threat of simple, slow neglect. It would take until 1978 for the United States government to formally recognize what this small patch of Georgia coastline actually represented. That year, the clubhouse and the surrounding cottages were designated a National Historic Landmark District, official acknowledgement that this site, regardless of how the state had struggled to make it profitable, held genuine significance in the story of the nation itself. The recognition was not enough on its own to save the buildings from continued deterioration, but it opened a path forward. Through the early 1980s, restoration work slowly transformed the decaying clubhouse and several of its surrounding cottages, repairing what decades of salt air and neglect had nearly destroyed. In 1985, the old Jekyll Island Club reopened its doors once again, not as a private retreat for the wealthiest families in the world, but as a public hotel, open to absolutely anyone willing to book a room. Today, visitors walk the same oyster shell paths that Morgan and Rockefeller once strolled. They tour cottages that once stood empty and rotting, now restored to something close to their original splendor, filled not with bankers plotting secret legislation, but with tourists snapping photographs and asking their guides whether the stories about the duck hunt are actually true. The island that once belonged exclusively to a sliver of the world's wealthiest families now belongs, quite literally, to everyone. Chapter 11. The Ghosts That Still Set the Rate. Walk through the Jekyll Island Club today, and you will find no trace of secrecy left anywhere in the building. Crane Cottage, built on the ashes of a house that burned in 1914, now hosts weddings, strangers exchanging vows, and rooms where a Chicago plumbing magnate once entertained Gilded Age society. The old clubhouse sells souvenirs and postcards to tourists who arrive by the busload, snapping photographs in the same hallways where a German-born banker once paced late into the night, wrestling with how to disguise a central bank as something the public might actually accept. Tour guides walk visitors past the spot where Red Row once stood. Now, an empty lawn beside an amphitheater, the families who live there reduced to a few sentences in a brochure, if they are mentioned at all. Every man who sat at that table in November of 1910 is long dead. The fortunes they represented, that almost incomprehensible 1/6 of the entire world's wealth, gathered for dinner in a single dining room on a small Georgia island, have long since been divided, spent, taxed, inherited, and scattered into the wind. What remains of them now is paint on old wood, a few sepia photographs in a museum, and a nickname, the First Name Club, that most visitors walking these grounds have never even heard. But something else remains too, something that never went away, never decayed, never needed restoration funding, or a National Historic Landmark designation to survive. The institution those men quietly built in 10 secret days, disguised as a hunting trip, hidden from a public who would have rejected it outright had they known. That institution is still here. It still decides how easily you can borrow money for a home, a car, an education. It still shapes how much a dollar in your pocket is actually worth. It is, in every meaningful sense, still running more than a century later, on architecture first sketched by lamplight behind the locked doors of a Millionaires club. The men who built it are gone. The wealth they represented has scattered, but the Federal Reserve, born in secrecy, raised in disguise, and never once put directly to a popular vote, still quietly sets the rate.